victims of terrorism. Today's event falls under the shadow of the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet we must not forget the human dimension of terrorism. The victims whose lives continue to be affected long after the attack is over. Today also falls today after the World Humanitarian Day, established following the attack on the United Nations headquarters in Iraq on 19th of August 2003. The proximity of these two international days is not lost on us, and we remember our fallen colleagues today too. In line with the Secretary General's call to action for human rights, my office and the United Nations system as a whole are fully committed to ensuring that the human rights of victims are at the heart of our efforts to prevent and counter terrorism and violent extremism conducive to terrorism. I now give the floor to Ambassador Ras, permanent representative of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, co-chair of the group of Friends of Victims of Terrorism, and moderator of the high-level segment of the webinar. You have the floor, Madam Ambassador.
Thank you. Your Excellency, Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Guterres, Your Excellency, President of the General Assembly, Mr. Tijani Muhammad Bande, Your Excellency, USG, Mr. Vladimir Voronkov, distinguished participants, good morning. It is my distinct honor to extend a warm welcome to all the participants who are joining us today in this webinar to virtually commemorate this important event, the third International Day of Remembrance of and tribute to the victims of terrorism. Today, we are here to recognize the grief, suffering, and resilience of victims and survivors of terrorism. We are here to respect the memory of the innocent lives taken by terrorists and stand in solidarity and unity with their families and friends. We are gathered to reaffirm our commitment and strong support to those affected, and while also condemning the acts of terrorism by all its forms and manifestations. Terrorism does not recognize borders, religion, race, or nationality. The victims' experience of pain and suffering, their families' loss and grief is the same across the globe. The rise in terrorism and increase in their heinous attacks is the new challenge of the 21st century. The use of violence in creating terror is their weapon to destroy societies and create hatred. However, the resilience of our people, the compassion among our society, and the solidarity on our voices will be our win against them. Acknowledging the loss of innocent lives could never be returned back, but our reach out and standing together with victims to be protected, to have fair access to justice, and compensations when needed, to have the necessary medical and psychological support, and to help them in their collective efforts in addressing the menace of terrorism. Afghanistan as a nation has been the victim of terrorism. On a daily basis, we lose our children, our brilliant talents, and our experience in educated members of the society to various terrorist attacks. Only in the last 7 months, we have lost 752 innocent lives and had 1,237 injuries. It may come across only as a number, but it is beyond painful when the society tries to get back together after the bloodiest and the most inhuman terrorist attack. The recent terrorist attack on a maternity ward where 24 people, including mothers, while giving birth, and the newborn children that never met their parents were killed. That's when we get speechless. By tabling the resolution on the International Day of Remembrance of and tribute to the victims of terrorism in 2017 and the resolution on enhancement of international cooperation to assist victims of terrorism in 2019, Afghanistan expresses its readiness to further amplify the voice of victims of terrorism and to mobilize our joint efforts in the fight against this menace. August 24th not only marks the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Terrorism, but it also should remind us of the devastating impacts and consequences of terrorism on humanity. It should reinforce our determination to continue taking strong counter-terrorism measures and to deny impunity and pursue accountability to the perpetrators of terrorist acts and their supporters. Today, it should once again signify our strong message that we're all together in our fight against terrorism and that we won't stand down until we guarantee the safety of our people. In closing, I once again would like to reiterate our sympathy and solidarity with the victims and survivors of terrorism and renew our commitment to strengthening international cooperation to combat terrorism. Thank you. And I now call for observing a minute of silence for victims of terrorism. Thank you. It is now my great pleasure and honor to invite His Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, to deliver the keynote speech. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, today we commemorate the 3rd International Day of Remembrance of and Tribute to the Victims of Terrorism. We stand in solidarity with the families who have lost loved ones, the wounded survivors, and those whose lives have been forever changed by acts of terrorism. We pay tribute to their courage, resilience, and fortitude. And we commit to raising their voices and seeking truth and justice. We cannot undo the damage done, but we can defend their human rights and dignity. We have a duty to ensure they are always heard and never forgotten. The 3rd International Day of Remembrance of and Tribute to the Victims of Terrorism takes place while the world is in turmoil. The COVID-19 crisis has changed the way we live and interact with each other. Vital services for victims, such as criminal justice processes and psychological support, have been interrupted, delayed, or ended, while governments focus attention and resources on fighting the pandemic. As many commemorations and memorials have been cancelled or moved online due to the pandemic response, victims have not been able to receive the comfort of being physically together in solace and solidarity. This includes the first ever United Nations Global Congress of Victims of Terrorism, which has been postponed to next year due to COVID-19. And of course, we have had to hold today's commemoration virtually. It does not compare to being together in person to remember and to honor loved ones. But it is important that we keep a spotlight on this important issue. Excellencies, we have come a long way in our collective efforts to support victims of terrorism, but we still have much to do. My report in April recommended establishing a voluntary funded program to support member states to provide long-term, durable assistance to victims. I look to the groups of friends of victims of terrorism to lead on the implementation of the report's recommendations, and I thank the permanent representatives of Afghanistan and Spain for their strong leadership and vision. The United Nations will continue to support member states' efforts to draft and adopt legislation and national strategies to help victims. I'm always inspired and deeply moved by the bravery and resilience of the survivors of terrorist attacks. Their message to me remains clear. We are here, we must not be forgotten, and we need your support. So let us continue remembering and honoring all victims of terrorism, even and especially in times of crisis. Victims should remind us every day of the importance of our counterterrorism efforts. We need to listen to them. Let us put in place measures that uphold their rights to justice, protection, support, and rehabilitation so they can rebuild their lives. Let us do everything in our power to prevent terrorist attacks and demand that those responsible are held accountable. And let us stand together, bound by the shared values and freedoms which unite us against terrorism in all its forms. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency, the UN Secretary General, for his keynote remarks and the expression of support and solidarity with the victims of terrorism. Now, I am delighted to invite His Excellency, Mr. Tijani Muhammad Bande, the President of the General Assembly, to deliver his remarks. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Your Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, Your Excellency, Vladimir Voronkov, Under-Secretary General of the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism, my dear sister, the co-chair of the group of friends of victims of terrorism, and our moderator today, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I thank the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism for inviting me to this important event. The International Day of the Remembrance of and Tribute to the Victims of Terrorism presents the international community with a moment of reflection and an opportunity to honor the memories of the innocent victims who have lost their lives as a result of terrorist acts around the world. Today, we stand with the families of the victims and the survivors of terrorism, and we salute your resilience. Terrorism in all its forms and manifestations can never be justified. Acts of terrorism everywhere must be strongly condemned. 75 years ago, the leaders of the world committed to a future of peace where we, the peoples, would, quote, practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors and unite our strength to maintain international peace and security, unquote. In upholding this words of the Charter of the United Nations, we commit to combating terrorism in full compliance with established international norms. The General Assembly adopted resolutions to fight the scourge of terrorism and uphold the freedoms and human rights of the people we serve. It has worked to strengthen cooperation to prevent and combat terrorism, to address impunity, and to pursue accountability for the perpetrators and supporters of acts of terrorism. Together, we will combat hate speech, xenophobia, and all the early indicators of extremism which lead to terrorism. Let me assure you, the General Assembly will not cease in its search for peace until everyone everywhere is free from fear. To the survivors of acts of terrorism who join us today, I thank you for your courage in speaking out about your experience. On this International Day, we will commit to amplifying your voice, supporting your needs, and upholding your human rights. We must further strengthen national and international mechanisms to support you and your families to ensure full recovery, rehabilitation, and integration into society through long-term multidimensional support, including physical, psychological, social, and financial support. In recognizing the different efforts of terrorism on men and women, we need to adopt a gender-sensitive approach in supporting victims. It's crucial that we safeguard the rights of women who have survived acts of terrorism, particularly for displaced women and those living in fragile contexts such as conflict situations. You have survived unimaginable trauma and pain, but do not let it define you. Your story does not end with the word victim. You are indeed survivors. Together, we can ensure that you live a full life defined by dignity and freedom. You are not alone in this journey. You are not forgotten. The United Nations General Assembly and the entire United Nations family is and will continue to be with you every step of the way. I wish you and your families all the best for the future. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, for your remarks and robust support, always. And now I would like to invite my good friend, His Excellency, Mr. Agustin Santos Rivera, the Ambassador and Representative of Spain to the United Nations, to make remarks on behalf of the group of victims of terrorism.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Ras, Your Excellency, President of General Assembly, Your Excellency, Mr. Secretary General Guterres, Your Excellency, and the Secretary General Voronkov, distinguished ambassadors, respected victims of terrorism, ladies and gentlemen. It is my honor to speak on behalf of the group of friends of victims of terrorism on the occasion of the Third International Day of Remembrance of and Tribute to the Victims of Terrorism. Today, we reiterate our firm commitment as a global community of nations to fight against the threat of terrorism in all its forms, while recognizing and supporting the voice of victims of terrorism and their families. This is the day we would like to amplify the voices of support and solidarity to the victims of terrorism and demonstrate that we are united, resilient, and stand against terrorism. The heinous and evolving threat of terrorism has proven to be one of the biggest challenges of the 21st century. The non-stop violence and suffering provoked by it has left deep wounds around the world, making it clear that this menace affects all of us and requires a cohesive and united front for its defeat. When talking about defeating terrorism, we often talk about the important role of security and on fighting terrorist groups and criminal associates on the ground. Terrorism will only be effectively defeated through actions that promote and protect the rights of victims of terrorism, in particular women and children, and which incorporate the invaluable voice of the victims and the lessons learned from their experience. Excellencies, since the formation of the group of friends 1 year ago, we have advocated on the importance of supporting victims of terrorism and on providing them a platform through which their voices can be consistently heard and their concerns addressed. The General Assembly has recognized its importance through the adoption of 2 resolutions that have been previously mentioned. The group has continued its efforts through convening expert and high-level meetings, including the first ministerial meeting of the group of friends last September, that we intend to celebrate again next September. As we suffer from the dreadful effects of COVID-19, it is important that member states keep working to develop comprehensive plans in order to ensure that the voices of those affected are given the attention they deserve. In this sense, we think that the organization next year of the first International Congress for Victims of Terrorism, postponed this year due to the pandemic, will be an important milestone in this process. And we look forward to collaborating to the success of this Congress. It is also important to remember that the pandemic has not slowed down terrorism, and that while new attacks continue to take place, the needs of victims from previous attacks remain. We need to redouble efforts to continue to assist to them and communicate with them throughout the duration of this pandemic. Excellencies, this is the 3rd year of this movement. We hope that more member states will be able to join this process. We need to work together to address the phenomenon of terrorism through our individual counter-terrorist strategies and the effective and comprehensive implementation of the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy. And with that said, I would like to once again express, on behalf of all the members of the group of friends, our firm commitment and support to continue working for the victims of terrorism. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Augustine. As it said, today is a day that it provides an important platform for the victims to share their bitter stories of pain and suffering and raise their voices for preventing and combating terrorism. Here at this spot, we have 2 speakers, the victims and survivors of terrorism, who have kindly agreed to share their stories and their remarks and their reflection with us today. I first invite Dr. Fatima Ali Haidar to deliver her remarks. Ms. Fatima, the floor is yours.
Thank you, ma'am. Honorable Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Fatima Ali Haidar, and I lost my husband and my son in a terrorist incident in Pakistan in 2013. Though I was already working as a general physician at that time, the incident made me infinitely aware of the practical and emotional needs of those affected by terrorism. Therefore, in 2015, I set up an initiative called the Grief Directory to offer healthcare, educational, and emotional support to the victims of terrorism. The provision of effective psychological counseling, vocational training, employment opportunities, continued health care, especially in cases of disability, and most importantly, women's empowerment, as many families are headed by women, have been major challenges that the Pakistani victims have been facing. Pakistani victims also lack acknowledgement and recognition of their suffering by their fellow citizens. We realized very early on in our work that offering support to thousands of civilian victims without institutionalized mechanisms of support was impossible without state support and a centralized database for which we've been advocating since 2017. Another problem was addressing the prevalent desensitization. Every year, we arrange meetings between victims and young Pakistanis. It is an emotionally overwhelming experience for our youth, the young Pakistanis, but it helps to build empathy between victims and the society. We call it a bridge of compassion. COVID-19 is a threat for the well-being of all, but most importantly, and especially for the victims of terrorism, as understandably, most of the support is being redirected towards the pandemic. This has serious consequences for the victims in countries like Pakistan, where there is no institutionalized support beyond the one-time financial compensation. Your Excellency, I welcome the resolution calling upon member states to develop comprehensive assistance plans. I urge all member states to create and implement, in consultation with victims, legislations to assist victims of terrorism, which should also include the earlier terrorist incidents. We also hope to better memorialize the lives lost by building monuments, dedicating sections in museums, and establishing national days of remembrance. This acknowledgement is essential, but impossible without state support. As we are virtually gathered here to remember the precious lives lost due to terrorism, I am reminded of something that a young volunteer once said to me after meeting the victims. As she said, "It is absolutely crucial that we recognize and remember the face, the family, and the community behind each number that we quote as casualties of terrorism." Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fatima, for sharing your very emotional story with us, and as well as your reflection on how do we address the pain and the suffering of the victims and how we could be effective. Now I would like to call on Mr. Ahmed Haji to deliver his remarks, but my technical team is telling me that we have a recorded message from him because technically we couldn't get in touch with him live. Thank you.
Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor to participate in today's commemoration of the International Day of and tribute to the victims of terrorism. My name is Ahmed Haji and I'm one of the survivors of the July 2010 terrorist attack at Chadulo Rugby Grounds in Kampala, Uganda. We were mostly young people watching the 2010 World Cup finals when the attacker detonated explosives that claimed 74 lives and injured 75. Moments after the explosion, there was so much chaos and my spectacles fell off, leaving me in a state of blindness. I did not even know that I was bleeding. A good Samaritan took me to the nearest hospital where a bomb fragment was removed from my cheek. My physical injury was not very severe, but it earned me a scar that has refused to go away. 10 years down the road, I want to believe that I have moved on, but the fact is I continue to struggle with emotional trauma and the fact that justice remains a distant reality. This has been made worse by COVID-19, which, like terrorism, knows no borders. But COVID-19 has taught me that I need to be strong and push on with my peace-building activism against violent extremism, because this is the time when the world is more vulnerable to terrorism than ever. The International Day is a reminder that terrorism is with us and knows no borders. No race, no sex, no religion, no status, no age. It is also an assurance that victims of terrorism that we are not alone. My message to the UN and the member states is the following. There needs to be a better and a more sustained coordination and coherence to support victims like me and others. Member states should enhance their cooperation with victims and other stakeholders, including civil society organizations, to exchange expertise, collect data, identify gaps and solutions, and share good practices. Thank you.
Thanks to Mr. Ahmed Haji for sharing his very painful and emotional story with us, and of course, his very strong message to all of us. Now it is my pleasure to invite Dr. Ronald Luptaka, the chairperson of the Inter-Parliamentary Union's High-Level Advisory Group on Countering Terrorism and Violent Extremism, to deliver his remark. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Dear Mr. Secretary General, dear Mr. Under-Secretary General, dear honorable colleagues, it is a great honor to address you on behalf of all IPU member parliaments, the occasion of the International Day Remembrance of Victims of Terrorism. To begin, I would like to express solidarity with all victims and survivors of attacks. Dr. Fatima Ali Haider and Ahmed Haji, they showed how important it is to listen to victims of terrorism. Yesterday, during the virtual part of the 5th World Conference of Speakers of Parliament, and on the eve of the International Day, IPU and the National Council of Austria held a special event on counter-terrorism with the focus of the perspective of victims of terror. And here my special thanks to the United Nations for supporting our initiative, which I hope will become a good tradition to speak out against terrorism and promote the voices of victims among parliamentarians. Despite all the global challenges, we should further accelerate our joint efforts to uphold the rights and address the needs of victims of terrorism. I would like to express my appreciation and full support for the proposal of the United Nations Secretary General to develop model legislation which should specifically respond to interests and needs of victims. Indeed, victims of terrorism have specific needs, such as recognition, participation, and commemoration. These and many other elements must be translated into concrete actions. This is why, within the joint program managed by IPU, UNOCT and UNODC, we are giving our utmost importance to the development of this model legislation. The drafting process will culminate with the presentation of recommended legislative provisions at a meeting with parliamentarians, and I would like to thank the Italian Senate for their strong commitment, despite all the global challenges, to host this parliamentary meeting at the Italian Senate in Rome. I look forward to meeting you at the first United Nations Congress of Victims of Terrorism in New York and at the in-person part of the 5th World Conference of Speakers of Parliament in Vienna in 2021. It is important to strongly continue the collaboration between the United Nations and IPU and the common efforts to uphold the rights and address the needs of victims of terrorism. Thank you.
I thank Dr. Luptka for your remarks and as well as the excellent work that IPU does and the potential collaboration that could be formed between the UN and IPU work. Thank you again. And now I would like to invite you to watch a short film named Not Forgotten: Stories of Remembrance of Victims of Terrorism, which demonstrates the stories of the victims and survivors from different parts of the world with testimonies and their individual journey and experiences.
I lost my dad when I was 4 months old.
J'ai perdu mon mari et mon fils aux attentats du Casablanca
Perdí a mi padre en los atentados del 11 de marzo en Madrid.
I'm working as security guard. I lost my left eye.
As I was approaching the finish line area, there was the second explosion, and it was directly to my left side.
ناطي 6 قتلى من أقربائي ووالدي جريح حالته خطرة أخوي حالته خطرة.
My beautiful 21-year-old daughter was in London and walked out into a terror attack.
My wife was working with the United Nations World Food Program in Islamabad.
We were at the end of our meal. A young boy jumped in and saying Allahu Akbar in shot at the forehead of one foreigner who was sitting just close to our table. And I was trying to protect my wife, my sister-in-law, and her daughter. So I was actually like this. I was trying to cover them. So it was why I asked him if they want to shoot, he could shoot me. And he did so. When I realized that I can move, I heard the voice of my son. Who said, Dad, I was shot.
Australian terrorist police came to our house and said, we have a body, still not confirmed. They recommended that we fly to London.
She had to be buried quick because there were about 52 pellets in her body.
You don't really know what to do.
My dad was the breadwinner. My mom was jobless at the time. With a 4-month-old baby at 21, you really don't have much to fall back on.
I can't describe how devastating as a parent to lose a child in these circumstances is for the rest of your life.
We all have coping mechanisms for things in life which are bad. You have an accident, you know how to cope with it. Terminal illness, you know how to cope with it. But there is no coping mechanism for a person who dies in an act of terror.
Mi padre era un hombre bondadoso, generoso, muy trabajador.
Sarah was very responsible, capable, vibrant, full of life.
He was a nicely dressed man because even when he passed on that day, he had a suit on. Every time I wear a suit, I always remember my dad.
COVID-19 affected many victims of terrorism, the occasional lockdowns, restriction of movement.
Normally I would go to London and visit the steps where she was killed at Borough Markets, but we weren't allowed to travel.
Le début du Covid, je n'ai jamais eu l'occasion d'aller sur les tombes de mon mari et de mon fils.
COVID, it's going to unearth our past hurts and wounds.
يعني أصلاً أنا شفت كل شيء تعرضت له ما حد شايفه. فبدون حظر أنا متأذي نفسيا. الحظر زادني أكثر.
Make me remind this incident and make me so weak.
Because we don't know the date it's going to end, people have really struggled with that a lot. And having too much time, then your mind wanders.
Sometimes you feel like a little bit guilty.
A mi padre le recuerdo todos los días y no me ha hecho falta el confinamiento para acordarme más, porque ya lo hacía. Desgraciadamente sí que ha habido víctimas que se han sentido muy solas. Es importante recoger a esas personas y explicarles que aunque estemos pasando por una pandemia tan grave, se puede superar, porque hemos pasado por cosas peores.
The long-term impacts of surviving any kind of an attack is that the traumatic experience affects you, doesn't really ever go away.
We have a common bond. We can relate to each other, empower each other. We don't judge each other because of color, because of ethnic backgrounds.
No es bueno hacer divisiones porque precisamente es lo que los terroristas buscan, que nos dividamos como sociedad y nos enfrentemos unos a otros.
Everyone wants to keep the spirit of their loved one alive. You can never, ever forget them for one day.
Pour moi, je ne les oublierai jamais. Ils sont là avec moi tout le temps.
when you're growing, it really doesn't have a heavy impact on you, but as life starts to unfold, mostly I'll find myself asking, if I do this and my dad was around, would he be proud of it?
I don't want to give up. Terrorists make my life go back. I have to go forward for my life.
International Day shows how to support the victims of terrorism and to provide them a forum to speak out.
It's like a moment to reflect about the situation of victims and to really empathize with them.
They unite the victims. That's very significant for the victims.
C'est une façon de lutter contre la radicalisation qui aboutit au terrorisme.
It shows that they're not forgotten. It would give them a big relief.
I thank our technical team for putting together this very emotional and very strong film about the experience and the losses of many of people around the globe, regardless from which continent they're coming. The experience and the pain is the same. Thank you, team. Now it is my honor to invite the man behind who have put together this wonderful webinar today and who is the strongest advocate for the voice of victims, and as well as working on the combat and fight against terrorism. And that's Mr. Voronkov. Mr. Voronkov, the floor is yours for your concluding remarks.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. Thank you, dear Adele, for excellent moderating of today's event. It's really very moving, very powerful. The powerful stories we just watched remind us of the need to listen to the victims' voices and to do more to ensure that our commitments translate into tangible and positive changes in victims' lives. Ms. Secretary General, I understand that you need to leave, so please me reiterate my deep gratitude for your participation in today's event. We look forward to continue working under your leadership to keep the momentum and ensure that victims' needs and rights remain at the center of all our work. Thank you, Ms. Secretary General, for your participation, and thank you again for being together with us today. So, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, we just watched a powerful and moving film. The message is clear. Victims represent the very human dimension of terrorism. I'm humbled when I hear them relive some of their most personal and painful memories. Terrorists try to depersonalize victims by reducing them to mere numbers or statistics. We have a responsibility to do the exact opposite. We must see victims' hopes, dreams, and daily lives that we have been shattered by terrorist violence, a shattering that carries on long after the attack is over. We must ensure their human rights are upheld and their needs are met. My office has placed the rights of victims at the center of its work in line with the Secretary General's call to action for human rights, supporting victims and victims association so their voices are heard and amplified. As the world focuses on the response to the COVID-19 crisis, it's more important than ever to take time to remember victims and survivors of terrorism. We have heard about the growing momentum of international efforts to support victims, but we need to ensure that well-meaning statements from promises, and resolutions lead to a concrete and sustained action. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the powerful stories you heard today show the terrible reality of terrorism, but they also shine through as an examples of resilience and beacons of hope, courage, and solidarity in the face of adversity. Today we reaffirm our common humanity. Today is about remembrance, but also it is about action. Let's build upon the strong international momentum to support victims and survivors ahead of the first United Nations Global Congress of Victims next year. Let's do more to raise awareness of their needs and rights. And let's commit to showing them that they are not alone and will never be forgotten. Please stay with us as we move to the second part of the event, which is an interactive discussion with the victims associations, and international organizations, moderated by the well-respected journalist Nicolas Henin, who himself is a victim of terrorism. This interactive discussion will continue after a musical interlude performed by the United Nations Chamber Music Society. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you for being together with us.